السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين. أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله وعلى آلك وأصحابك يا سيدي يا حبيب الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. When the kuffar, they broke the treaty of Hudaybiyah, which was meant to last 10 years, but in less than 2 years they had already violated the agreement. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam decided, in order for there to be peace, sukoon, itminan in the Arabian Peninsula, there was only one way. And so Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he left from Madinatul Munawwara with his companions who had gathered in the month of Ramadan, and 12,000 of them arrived in Makkatul Mukarramah, as we mentioned. Before Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam entered into Makkatul Mukarramah, he set up his tent in a place called Al-Hajun, which is modern day we refer to as Jannatul Ma'la. Jannatul Ma'la is the graveyard in Makkatul Mukarramah. Now, why did he set up his tent here? So first and foremost, the Meccans, they had taken all of the property of the Muslims. जो भी उन्होंने छोड़ा था, घर हो, सामान हो, जो भी, they had taken all of it and they had used it for themselves. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the companions, they had no more possessions in Makkatul Mukarramah. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam could have set up his tent in any place. Why Jannatul Ma'la? Now somebody might think maybe because his father was buried there, but his father was not buried in Makkatul Mukarramah. He had passed away on the way back from Gaza and was buried in Madinatul Munawwara. Maybe for his mother, but his mother was not buried in Makkah. She had passed away in Abwa. So who was buried in Jannatul Ma'la, by which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for his entire stay in Makkah, 19 days, his tent would remain in this area. And before he would even enter into Makkatul Mukarramah, he would go into the cemetery and he would make dua at the grave of this individual. He spent his time, he set his tent there in order to be close to one person and one person only. The person who had supported him for 25 years of his life. Financially, in terms psychologically, whenever Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was in any type of difficulty, the one who came to the aid of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his biggest supporter, none other than our mother Sayyidah Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha. Before he entered into Makkatul Mukarramah, first he went into the cemetery, Jannatul Ma'la, at the grave of our mother, and he made dua for her. And even at this point, he did not forget Sayyidah Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha. This shows how beloved she was to him. And 19 days he spent there. He did not go anywhere else. His tent was pitched there, and he stayed there by the side of Sayyidah Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha. After this, he entered into Makkatul Mukarramah, and the flag was placed in that area, Al-Hayf, where the kuffar had made the plan to exile the Muslims from Makkah. Yani in the 6th year and 7th year, when the Muslims had become very strong at that point, because Sayyidina Hamza had accepted Islam, Sayyidina Umar had accepted Islam, then for 3 years they exiled the Muslims from Makkah. That area where they had made the plan, this is where the flag was now placed. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam entered into Makkah, as we mentioned, with Sayyidina Abu Bakr on his right, Sayyidina Usayd bin Hudayr on his left, on his camel Al-Qaswa behind him, Sayyidina Usama bin Zayd wearing a black amama sharif and a helmet. And in this manner, with complete humility and humbleness, his head lowered, beard touching the saddle of his camel, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam entered in this dignified manner into the city of Makkatul Mukarramah. Then he tied his camel, the reins of his camel, and he began to perform tawaf of the Kaaba. During this time, certain individuals, they had certain thoughts which came into their hearts. Like Abu Sufyan, he started thinking, with which force did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam defeat us? How did he manage to do this? And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam looked towards him, he smiled, he placed his hand on his chest and he said, Abu Sufyan, it was none other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who gave us victory. Abu Sufyan again, now Iman was going deep into his heart. He said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu annaka Muhammad Rasulullah. You must be the Prophet of Allah. These were my innermost thoughts. On this tawaf or another tawaf, as Rasulullah was going around, one individual whose name was Fadala ibn Umair, he thought Rasulullah is right here. All I have to do is strike Rasulullah and everything will be finished. These thoughts were coming into his heart. Rasulullah turned his sight towards him. He said, Fadala, what are you thinking? What are you planning? Fadala said, nothing. Rasulullah carried on looking at him. Ya Rasulullah, I was doing the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Rasulullah started smiling and he said, Fadala, may Allah forgive you. He came to him and he placed his hand onto his chest. Sayyidina Fadala says, when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam lifted his hand from my chest, at that point there was no one on the face of this earth that was more beloved to me than Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And all of that enmity, all of that hatred, all of that had come out of my heart. And now I love the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam more than anyone in this world. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam continued his circuits of the Kaaba, doing tawaf of the Kaaba. And as he was doing the tawaf, he took his asa or his bow and he started pointing towards the idols. In some narrations they mention he didn't even touch the idols. He just pointed towards them and he recited the verse, جاء الحق وزهق الباطل إن الباطل كان زهوقا. Truth has come and falsehood has perished. It has been destroyed. It has been annihilated. Indeed, verily, falsehood was always meant to be destroyed. As Rasulullah started doing ishara towards the idols which were facing forwards, they fell on their face. And the ones that were facing backwards, they fell upon their back. And like this, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he completed the circuits of the Kaaba. And the idols, the ones around the Kaaba had been destroyed. Now there were some big idols which were on top of the Kaaba, which had been planted into the roof of the Kaaba. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam went close to the Kaaba. He said to Ali, get down. Then he thought, no. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself knelt down. And he said to Ali, climb on my shoulders. Sayyidina Ali radiallahu ta'ala says, yeah, this is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But he was instructing him so he could go onto the Kaaba and remove those idols. He wanted Sayyidina Ali to be the one that removes them. So Sayyidina Ali radiallahu ta'ala an karamallahu wajhul kareem, he places his feet onto the shoulders of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam lifts Sayyidina Ali radiallahu ta'ala an up. And there are people today who say all types of things against our master Sayyidina Ali radiallahu ta'ala an. But when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has raised him, then no one can bring him down. No one can lower Sayyidina Ali radiallahu ta'ala. He says, at that point when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam lifted me up, I felt that if I stretched my hands would go past the stars into the seven heavens. This is how it felt on the shoulders of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says, I ascended onto the Kaaba. And one by one, I began to destroy the idols. One of them, it was really stuck inside. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam instructed me to lift it because it pegged into the Kaaba. Imagine this. That building which Sayyidina Ibrahim had made as a symbol of the oneness of Allah. The kuffar had done so much injustice that they had filled it with 360 idols. One by one, Sayyidina Ali karamallahu wajhul kareem, he destroyed the idols from the top of the Kaaba. And then he came down. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he asked for the keys of the Kaaba. Sayyidina Uthman bin Talha, he was from Banu Abdiddar. He used to be in charge of the keys. He knew who had the keys. It was his mother. He goes back to his house. He asks his mother for the keys. She refuses. He insists. Rasulullah wants the keys. They have back and forth. Eventually he is able to get the keys of the Kaaba. He comes. When Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he attains the keys, he opens the door of the Kaaba. And inside, what do they find? What's inside the Kaaba? Again, so many idols, pictures, statues. He sends the companions inside. They begin to cleanse the Kaaba of all of this impurity, all of this shirk. When Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam goes inside, there were 2 statues still there, because the companions were not sure what to do with it. The kuffar had made idols, statues of Sayyidina Ibrahim and Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam as well. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, may Allah destroy the kuffar. Because in the hands of Sayyidina Ibrahim and Sayyidina Ismail were arrows without heads. The kuffar, they used to use these arrows to predict the future. And this was a type of shirk. They used to try and predict the future with these types of arrows. And so Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said to the companions that Sayyidina Ibrahim and Sayyidina Ismail, they were free from these types of actions. They never did anything like this. And these types of idols, they were also removed. Yani Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he came with this mission of tawheed, oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in this manner now, the companions, they had cleansed the Kaaba from all types of shirk, all types of impurity. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam entered into the Kaaba with Sayyidina Usama, Sayyidina Bilal, Sayyidina Usman bin Talha, radiallahu ta'ala anhum. They entered into the Kaaba. They recited takbir in all 4 corners of the Kaaba, performed 2 rakat of salah, and then they came out of the Kaaba. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had the keys of the Kaaba in his hands. He turned to his companion Uthman bin Talha, and he said, think back all of those years when I was in Makkah al-Mukarramah before the Hijrah, and you had the keys of the Kaaba. What did I say to you at that day? I said to you, O Uthman bin Talha, a day will come when these keys will end up in my hands. And on that day, I will give the keys to whomever I will. Did I not say this? So, Uthman bin Talha said, Ya Rasulullah, you did say this. This was the prophecy of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he took the keys and he gave them back to Sayyidina Uthman bin Talha radiallahu ta'ala. He said, this was your job, this will remain as your job, and only that person who is unjust will ever take these keys from you. Now at this point, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, all of the kuffar, they had gathered into the haram. They were waiting to see what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would say. At this point, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he gave his first khutbah. In this, he said that there is none worthy of worship but Allah. He has no partners. Allah has fulfilled the promise that He made to me. Today, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has supported me. And every claim of privilege, you used to have pride in your families, in your tribes, all of this now is finished. In the face of Islam, all of this has been crushed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has indeed eradicated from you all pride of the time of ignorance and pride in your ancestry. Because all men are descendants of Adam, and Adam was created from clay. And then he recited the verse of the Quran, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha, wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qabaila lita'arafu, inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, inna Allah alimun khabir. O mankind, we have indeed created you from a male and a female, and have made you into various nations and tribes, so that you may know one another. Indeed, the most honorable among you in the sight of Allah is one who is most pious amongst you. Indeed, Allah is all-knowing, all-aware. And after this, Rasulullah, he mentioned now that declared that all sales of alcohol from this point forward are now haram. After this, Rasulullah is looking at the kuffar. The kuffar, they have their heads down in shame. Why do they have their heads down? Because they are remembering everything that they have done to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All of the pain that they have caused to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All of the hurt that they have caused. You know, right from the onset, they had placed thorns in the path of our beloved Rasul until his feet would bleed. They had sworn at him. They had beat him. They had thrown impurities at him. They had tried on numerous occasions to assassinate, to kill Rasulullah. They had waged war against him. They had killed his companions. They had killed his uncle. They had placed intestines on his back. They had put pressure on his son-in-laws to divorce his daughters. They had struck his eldest daughter, Sayyidah Zainab, with a spear which caused her to have a miscarriage. In addition to this, they had tortured his companions. They had placed ropes around their necks. They had dragged them into the streets. They had placed them on burning coals. They had placed heavy stones on their chest. They had whipped them. They had beat them. All of these things, all of these types of things that they had done to Rasulullah and his companions, they were all in their minds now. the heads hung in shame. If it was any other king, any other leader, and history is testament to this, history witnesses this. Think about the Crusades. Think about all of these leaders that have passed before. If it was any other leader, on this day, the streets of Makkah al-Mukarramah would have flowed with the blood of the kuffar. They would have been lined up one by one and they would have been killed for the injustices that they had done. But this was not any ordinary leader. Wasn't any ordinary individual. This was Rahmatul lil Alameen. This was he whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala referred to in the Quran as Ra'uf and Rahim. He says to the kuffar, what shall I do to you today? What am I going to do with you today? The kuffar at that time, they could only remember the mercy of Rasulullah. They said, Akhun Kareem wabnu akhin Kareem. You are a generous brother and you are the son of a generous brother. To which Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he smiled at them and he said to them, La tathriba alaykum al-yawm idhabu fa antum al-talaqa. There is no reproach on you today. Go because all of you are free. At that point, you could hear the kuffar crying. They were ready to be executed. They thought there was no other way to go about it. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, in one stroke, he had forgiven each and every single one of them. It's mentioned at that point, at that moment, at least half of them accepted Islam. The valley of Makkah al-Mukarramah was echoing with the cry of La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And because of this extreme mercy of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. After this, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he said to his companions, because remember they had possessed the property, they had taken the properties of the Muslims. Some of the companions were thinking, now we will take it back. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said to them, that leave it. Have mercy upon them and let them keep their property. Allah has given you better than this. So not only did he forgive them, but the property which they had stolen from the Muslims, he allowed them to keep that property as well. The Muslims now, the new Muslims, they began to come to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and they began to pledge allegiance to take bay'ah with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The men came first, they pledged allegiance to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then after this, the women came, and Sayyidah Aisha Siddiqa radiallahu ta'ala anha, she mentions that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would never touch the hand of a ghair mahram woman. None of them would give their hands in the hands of Rasulullah. Rather, they would say it verbally, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would say to them, I have accepted your pledge of allegiance. In this process, one person who came with her face wrapped up in front of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was whom? It was Hind bin Utbah. Yani she had spared no expense in order to fight against Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. She herself said that before I accepted Islam, whichever battle happened, I had come either myself to support the enemies of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I would spend every single penny I had against Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and there was no family on the face of this earth that I wanted to see disgraced more than the family of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. She came in front of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam accepted her pledge of allegiance as well, and she accepted Islam at this point as well. Sayyidah Hind bin Utbah, she would say after this point to Sayyidah Aisha Siddiqa radiallahu ta'ala an, that before there was no family that I wanted to see more disgraced, but now there is no family which I want to see honored more than the family of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is the change that would come about in the life of these individuals. After this, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam instructed all people to break the idols within their houses. He sent companions to various places, including the likes of Sayyidina Ali, Sayyidina Abu Sufyan, to various places in order to destroy all of the big idols which were in the various places around Makkah al-Mukarramah. The Ansar, they had an issue now. They see the love that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is showing to the Makkans, the affection he's showing to them. And they begin to think that now Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is back in Makkah al-Mukarramah. He's back in his hometown where he grew up, where he spent so many years of his life. Over 50 years of his life he spent in Makkah al-Mukarramah. So they begin to think, that's it now, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's going to stay in Makkah al-Mukarramah. And so they began to speak amongst themselves like this. So Rasulullah called the Ansar. And he said, did you say stuff like this? They said, Ya Rasulullah, we did. And at that point, Rasulullah said, Al-mahya mahyakum, wal-mamatu mamatukum. My life is your life and my death is your death. Meaning, O Ansar, don't think that I'm just going to leave you now. Rather, my life, what remains of it will be with you, and when I leave from this world, I will leave whilst I am amongst you. At that point, the Ansar, they say they cried and they cried. They were so overjoyed by Rasulullah because they had this protective jealousy of Rasulullah. They wanted to keep Rasulullah with them, and they didn't want to be separated from him sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rasulullah then instructed Sayyidina Bilal radiallahu ta'ala an to climb on top of the Kaaba and to give the adhan. Yeah, this would be one of the only times anyone would ever climb onto the Kaaba. And this for the kuffar, it was more hard upon them than the destroying of the idols. Because they had this mentality. They had these statuses amongst them. And to see someone like Sayyidina Bilal, who was nothing in their sight, to climb on top of the Kaaba, to give the adhan. Some of them, they said to one another, I'm glad that my father is no longer alive. I'm glad my father did not witness this day. And this is what they were. One of these individuals, his name was At-Tabi ibn Asid. He said these words, but later on he would accept Islam, and in fact he would change his entire life around. At the age of 20, Rasulullah would make him the governor of Makkah al-Mukarramah. Sayyidina Bilal radiallahu ta'ala, he ascends the Kaaba and he gives the adhan. Why Sayyidina Bilal? Rasulullah could have chosen any companion, right? There were so many great companions, he could have allowed them to go. Yes, he was the mu'adhin of Rasulullah, but anyone can give the adhan. Because at this point, the one who was most worthy was to stand on top of the Kaaba and remember the oneness of Allah, the tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, was that individual who 20 years previous, when he was under the rocks, he was crying out the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yani when they were piling up the stones up top of Sayyidina Bilal, the only name he knew of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in his final breaths before he passed out, he was shouting, Ahad, Ahad, Ahad. He was the only one to be worthy now to climb on top of the Kaaba to remember the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so like this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honored this individual who in this society had no value. Yani they treated their slaves worse than animals, but look at what respect 1400 years ago, not 100 years ago, not 200 years ago. Over 1400 years ago, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was showing the respect that Islam gives to all types of people from all different races and all different colors. This is the truthfulness of Islam. Islam does not determine, it doesn't give position based upon your lineage, on your nobility, on these types of things. Rather, it gives superiority, as Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned, in regards to your God consciousness. After this, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he instructed there was a few individuals that they would be killed. Under no circumstances they were to be let go, unless they came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and they sought forgiveness. Otherwise, they were going to be killed because of certain crimes that they had committed. One of them was Abdul Uzza ibn Khatal. He had accepted Islam. He was in Madinatul Munawwara when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent him out to collect the zakat. He had an argument with another Muslim who was also sent by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he had killed him. So when Abdul Uzza, he actually came out to fight against the Muslims. He was one of those who fought against Khalid bin Walid. He came out with a spear. When he saw that the Muslims were victorious, he fled. And so the Muslims, they went after him and they killed him because he had been given the death penalty. In addition to this, there was another individual, Huwayrith ibn Nuqaydir, who was a poet who used to insult Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was also given the death penalty. Miqyas ibn Subaha, if you remember back to the battle of Banu Mustalik, one Muslim died. He was killed by another Muslim. Rasulullah commanded, because it was a mistake, he said, give the blood money. The family gave the blood money. But the brother of the one who was killed, he still took revenge and he killed that Muslim. Meaning that person was innocent at that point. And he fled to Makkah al-Mukarramah. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam also gave him the death penalty because of murder. In addition to this, there was a few other individuals, but many of them, they got to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam first. They sought forgiveness and amnesty, protection from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rasulullah forgave them, and like this, they were spared from the death penalty. Amongst these, some of the people who fled from Makkah al-Mukarramah were the likes of Ikramah ibn Abi Jahl. Remember, this person had fought against Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam on so many occasions. He had got to Yemen and he wanted to leave from the Arabian Peninsula. His wife Hakim, she had gone to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and she had accepted Islam. Rasulullah sallallahu gave her the burda and said that this is a guarantee for Ikramah, even though he had done all of these things, that this was a promise that he would be protected. She went, she found her husband, she brought him back. Now imagine this. Despite all that he had done, when Ikramah came in front of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Rasulullah rushed to meet him with such speed that his chadar, his mantle, it came off of his shoulders. He hugged Ikramah, he accepted Islam. Safwan bin Umayyah, who would go to Safwan bin Umayyah? The person who he had chosen to assassinate Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If you remember, he had sent Umair bin Wahab. He had paid him and he said to him, if you kill Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I will give you X, Y, and Z. But instead, Umair had accepted Islam. He went to Safwan bin Umayyah. He brought him to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rasulullah sallallahu forgave him. And at this point, he did not accept Islam. But later, he too would accept Islam. And finally, Wahshi ibn Harb. Yani the one who had killed the uncle of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Eventually, he would come to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as well. Initially, he would flee from Makkah al-Mukarramah. He would go to Ta'if. And after that, he would come to Madinah al-Munawwarah. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would tell Wahshi, tell me, recount to me the way that you killed my uncle. And Sayyidina Wahshi would mention the whole incident, how it had transpired. At that point, the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would accept his tawbah. Sayyidina Wahshi would accept Islam, but he would say to him one thing: do not come directly in front of me. And the reason, the ulama, they mention various reasons. They say one of the reasons is because whenever Rasulullah would see him, he would remember his uncle, and so this would upset him. But the ulama have said no. Even in this action of Rasulullah, there was mercy. Why? Because when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would see Sayyidina Wahshi, he would remember his uncle, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would become sad. Some grief would come to his face, and when Sayyidina Wahshi would see this, then he would become upset, remembering that he had killed the uncle of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in the mercy of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said to Sayyidina Wahshi, don't sit right in front of me, sit to one side. Look at this mercy of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Sayyidina Wahshi, Rasulullah forgave him as well. He forgave Hind, who had mutilated the body of Sayyidina Hamza, right? She had made a necklace with the organs, yani the ears and the nose of Sayyidina Hamza. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he forgave her. So those whom Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam forgave, we forgive today as well. But now today, if anyone insults Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's not our job to forgive. Rasulullah can forgive whomever he wishes. In fact, in Makkah al-Mukarramah, and in closing note, something which is very important. One of the noble tribes, one of the noble families, a woman from them, she had stolen. This was after everything had settled down. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had laid the law down. This is the Sharia, so on and so forth. She had stolen, and therefore she was going to be punished for this crime. So they tried to go to Rasulullah and explain that, she's not from any average family, she's from one of the highest families in Makkah al-Mukarramah. They tried to go through Sayyidina Usama bin Zayd, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, no. In Islam, in this matter, everyone is equal. It's not like how it is nowadays, that the poor people, they get punished, and the wealthy people, they pull strings with politicians, and they pull favors with judges, and so on and so forth, and they're able to get out of this. No, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, do not be like the Banu Israel, because this is what they had done. And so Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam determined that she would be given punishment as well. In the meantime, in the surrounding areas, the Hawazin, when they had heard that the Quraysh had been defeated, they were preparing an army now to attack the Muslims in Makkah al-Mukarramah. And because of this, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, very shortly after, he would have to leave and deal with them. In regards to that, inshaAllah ta'ala, we will discuss that in the coming lectures. We finish here for today. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala khayra khalqi wa nuri arshi Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. We make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He forgives us for all our major and minor sins. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through His infinite mercy, give us all the ability to act upon the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to act upon the teachings of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. May He forgive us for all our major and minor sins. Sallallahu ta'ala ala khayra khalqihi wa nuri arshi Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin.